it's real nice to be here and visiting with you again. I hope I can bring you some good news. It's not automatic, though. Sometimes you have to search for good news when you leave Washington. The good news is I left Washington. I'm here. And it's also good news for me personally, because if you're there in Washington trying to fight the battles that we have, sometimes you get a false impression that there's nobody, you know, with you. Even the so-called good guys are saying the right things, but when you really look at what they're doing, we're not doing very much. And that's always disturbing to me. So we have the apparent bad guys, the guys that admit they love big government. I sometimes respect them more than the other ones who claim everything that we say, but never seem to achieve very much. So it is really good for me to get out of Washington, especially to get back to my district, because obviously if I was completely off track on advocating very, very limited government, I couldn't get elected. People do keep tabs on what you do and how you vote and what you believe in, and more so now than it was when I was in office before. I was in office between 76 and 84, so I've been out for 12 years. So it's easy to start comparing, you know, politics and events and how things are going. Washington is certainly different. I mean, being a member of the majority party is a lot better. There are some political advantages to it. The disadvantage, of course, is that sometimes the rhetoric sounds a lot better than what's really happening. For instance, we just recently heard the announcement within the last month that the budget has now been balanced, and that everything seems to be okay. You know, they sometimes argue, Republicans and Democrats argue, liberals and conservatives argue, and they always seem to come up with a compromise, and it usually means more spending and maybe slightly less taxes. So, and that's essentially what happened. They were feeling better about some of the statistics, which I think is an illusion. I think they're deceiving themselves as far as what's happening, but they've been led to believe that things are doing a lot better, revenues are up, and therefore they could afford more spending. And that's essentially what happened. I thought the budget bill was a disaster. And yet the announcement was total euphoria. I mean, if you would only exist in Washington and listen to that, you'd think, well, I don't need to be there anymore. I can go back to medicine. Things are doing so well. And we're, you know, hauling in and curtailing the power of the bureaucrats and doing so well. But then when you look at it, you know all the problems. I mean, what major event happened in the budget that affects us? That, of course, was a $20 billion increase in a new medical program. I mean, the whole problem's been that government's been involved in medicine. And yet the conservatives, you know, with this tremendous excitement and delight about a balanced budget, they say very little about the fact that we've introduced a brand new child care program that begins with $20 billion. And you know how that starts. It starts with a few billion, and before you know it, it's into the hundreds of billions of dollars, and you have programs as big as Medicare. Then they're unmanageable, then prices go up, then there's rationing, then there's managed care, the whole works. And we as physicians and believers in the Constitution and individual liberty have to continue to struggle and fight. On the positive side, though, I think the country is moving in the right direction slowly and precariously. That doesn't mean Washington is moving in the right direction yet, but the country has started to. I think there are more people now, from my viewpoint of having been in and out of politics and in and out of education, I think there are a lot more people in the country, in my district, who are more supportive of our views and demanding less government. People are sick and tired of it. And the healthiest part of this concern has been that now, statistically, and on various occasions this has been proven to be the case, is that it's down under 10% of the people who really trust the government. Now that's healthy. That is really healthy. I got myself into a little bit of a problem right off in the early part of the year. I was on C-SPAN, and I expressed some concern that not only did a lot of people not trust the government, they actually feared the government, like at Waco and a few other things. Now that was enough of a reason for the member in Texas who happened to be a liberal Democrat who represented Waco to get on the House floor and condemn me by name about saying that there was a reason to actually fear our government. Yet last week I just read an article that summarized some GSA statistics, and it shows that in 1996 we added 2,496 armed bureaucrats to our agencies. Not just bureaucrats, but we armed them. And it wasn't for the FBI. It was for the EPA and OSHA, Fish and Wildlife, and actually the land management people want to be armed as well. Well, why do they have to be armed? Well, they're thugs. They're coming and they're taking our property. And that's why people are getting mad. And they don't feel comfortable that they can get redress through the courts. And unfortunately, they've taken up that method of dealing with a problem. Now, I'm less inclined to violence because I'm frightened about getting shot, and I'd like to avoid that. And I try to do the things that so many of us have done, and that is try to change things politically. And I always rationalize and say, if a guy like me can get elected, we shouldn't give up yet, because people know exactly what I think about the government. So therefore, there are people out there, and we've been able to convince them in the particular district that I represent that we aren't satisfied with what is happening, and we certainly shouldn't be satisfied with what is happening in Washington. I have a very libertarian philosophy, as you know, and I have to defend it, and sometimes it's difficult. But I usually defend it very easily as far as explaining it to my colleagues. And when they have trouble with one of my votes or one of my positions, I'll ask them to explain their position in context of the Constitution. And that draws interesting responses. One of my staffers was meeting with another staffer from another office, and they say, "Your boss has a peculiar attitude about legislation. He insists that it always conforms with the Constitution." So he called it peculiar. So that's the way it is looked at sometimes. I had an amendment on the floor to stop corporate welfare and foreign welfare in the Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill. And it would have, I think it was $700 and some million. It would have taken all aid from OPIC and Export-Import Bank and other trade organizations that were absolutely beneficial to special corporations, and there was no constitutional justification for it. And Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi from California, not one of us, was representing the other side, and in the debate, I asked her right out, I said, because here she was, this so-called liberal worrying about this poor little people in the country, strongly supporting the benefits of the very wealthy corporation. I said, could the gentlelady point out to me in the Constitution where she gets this authority? And she paused for a minute and she looked and she says, "You know, I've never thought about that." She says, "I don't know where that is, but it's an interesting question." She says, "Maybe we should ask that more often, and maybe there is somebody else in the House that could answer that for you." So another Democrat got up on the floor and he said, "Well," he says, "that's no problem." He says, "That's under the General Welfare Clause." And I said, "Well, if it's a general welfare clause, how come you generally take money from taxpaying citizens and give it to some specific special interest groups?" I said, "That sounds like it's at the expense of the general welfare, and obviously they're distorting even this whole welfare state that they've justified under the general welfare clause. That is so much malarkey, you can't even tolerate it." But this came up again the other day that they felt compelled at least to answer it. The bill, I can't recall right now, but I mentioned it, it was on the education bill. It was on testing. We had an amendment to say the president could not test unless approved by the Congress. He can't just go out and do things like that without the Congress. And I got up and I said, "I support this amendment. I don't think the president should do this, but quite frankly, I don't believe, even with permission of the Congress, that you ought to be having nationalized testing." So this was a challenge to David Obey, who then got up, and he was very disturbed because he didn't want to let it stand that the whole program could be questioned on principle. So he made it very, very clear that education was a proper function of the federal government under the General Welfare Clause, just as national defense was. So that's how they come up with the answer. But I feel very compelled to try to present our case the best way I can on principle. I do not like to introduce amendments that would cut foreign welfare by 10%. Because you condone and endorse the notion that maybe 90% is permissible. And I'm much more interested in losing the vote if necessary, but pointing out they ought not to be doing these things. They ought not to be in medicine, they ought not to be in education, and we must force them to think in these terms. I fault so much of what's happening with the Republicans and the conservative revolution of the past couple years because they are so willing to concede the moral principle upon which the programs depend. That they are, for instance, taking the housing bill. That came through the Banking Committee and was on the House floor, and unfortunately I was the only Republican that opposed it. But the reason the conservatives liked it was they delivered the control of public housing locally. They put in block grants, and they added money. They added money, collected more money from you, endorsed the concept, but said this is the conservative answers to the liberal that we will allow the states to manage the funding and deal with public housing. But I think it's much more important to ask the question, because someday we're going to be bankrupt, because I don't quite buy into these arguments that we are balancing the budget. So it's much more important to be asking the question, should the government be involved? And that's why our organization is so important, because we do ask that question. And we deal with it on principle, unlike the other larger organization of medicine that does not deal on these same principles. So I think that it is key, it's crucial. I don't think we can win any other way other than to stand on a principle, state it, and if we can win a battle here and there, fine. If we can get a token win or at least nudge ourselves in a certain direction, that's okay. I happen to believe that the medical savings account allows that, although it's far from medicine being dealt with completely in the marketplace. At least, you know, I believe that moves us in the right direction. But stating the principle upon which free market medicine stands, I think, is crucial. Then, of course, in combination with that is the finding the best way to give proper care to a patient. And the two go together. I've always thought that I would stand for freedom and individual liberty, even if the standard of living of everybody in the country had to take a notch downward. But we never have to accept that notion. Matter of fact, the exact opposite is true. Not only do we have the moral position correct in what we advocate, we have the Constitution on our side, but we have the practical argument too. One that we have not dealt with very well. So often the welfare people, in the name of doing good, and they grab the moral high ground, and they're the only ones that care. And in a prosperous nation, in a wealthy nation, in a country that has become very wealthy through a free market, frequently this seems to be the case on the short run. That if there's a problem, if they steal a little bit of money here and pass it around, it looks like they're solving a problem. But we're moving into an age quite different than the 1950s as the welfare state really got rolling. We're dealing in a time now where we have seen the collapse of communism around the world. And in spite, once again, of the rhetoric and the statistics coming out of Washington, we are going to face the same or similar type of problem here with the welfare state, because I do not believe the welfare state will continue at this rate of spending, and therefore we will be obligated to come up with something a lot better. Taxes were slightly reduced. I voted for the tax bill. It was nothing worth bragging about. I mean, just because it did lower capital gains, it gave some benefits to families with children, and it did help on inheritance tax. It was a slight improvement. But one thing that the advocates of the balanced budget movement and the declaration of a balanced budget fails to emphasize, and that is, even if we could theoretically claim the budget is balanced, for instance, what they don't even deal with is the fact that currently we're increasing the national debt by $200 billion a year because we're borrowing from all the trust fund. But let's say even in spite of that, we could balance the budget at $1.7 trillion. It would be a disaster. The balanced budget would have to come with higher taxes. And we are already working for our government more than half the time. Isn't it sad and a bit ironic that the last day we pay for our taxes, including the cost of regulations but not including the cost of inflation, we work till July 3rd. Our first day of independence from the all government level of taxation is on July 4th. And the people are still very complacent. Upset and angry, but they're not quite sure. If they were very upset and concerned, they probably would not be endorsing our president quite to the degree that they are. But today there seems to be a fair amount of complacency along that line. We do live in an age where I think there's a lot more inflation than the government will concede. I think one thing we saw in the paper just yesterday and today that might be a measurement of inflation is the fact that a guy like Ted Turner can come up and donate $1 billion to his favorite charity, the United Nations. I mean, somebody asked me that yesterday. He said, "What do you think about Ted Turner donating $1 billion, to the United Nations?" I said, "That's probably the only place the UN should ever get any of their money, and never through taxation." But it's also very sad that the part of the free enterprise system that still exists, and I'm not sure that when you get into big finances that it is true free enterprise. It's much closer to special interest, a fascist type of system where the bankers and others can make a lot of money. But in many ways, though, the freedom we've had and the prosperity we have allowed the Jane Fondas and the Ted Turners to accumulate great wealth. And yet, they're our greatest enemies. And it is sad. So I don't think we're going to have Ted Turner send our organization a lot of money to fight for the cause of free medicine. He will continue to fight for the cause of internationalism. The United Nations is a cause that I have taken up since I've been back. I've never had much liking for the United Nations. My position is very complex about the United Nations. I think we should be out of the United Nations. Matter of fact, I'm not sure when there was a vote on that prior to this year, because I have a bill in to get out of the United Nations, but on the Foreign Operations Bill, I was able to bring it up as an amendment and force the people to vote on it. We had 54 members vote to get out of the United Nations, which is better than 4 or 8 or 10. So 54 is decent, but it was encouraging also to know there were a lot who supported that position but thought that they would be ridiculed back at home for taking such an extreme position. But I think that position is getting less extreme all the time when you think of how upset the American people are getting about putting our troops under UN command and foreign generals, seeing the signs put up around our national parks where you're seeing these biospheres and different parks being designated as international parks. Also, I read this morning that the United Nations has just sent a delegation from the Human Rights Commission to spend a couple weeks at the invitation of our president to investigate whether or not we're abusing in this country the capital crimes, capital murder, to put somebody to death. And they're going to come in and investigate us. I mean, just the idea of this. We had a problem down in Brazoria County where I live, and it was on national news, and you probably read about it. And that had to do with some tape that got out. It was about a year later. It happened last year, but it looked like the police probably were beating up on these prisoners. Exactly the circumstances what happened, I do not know, and it probably deserves some investigation. But I, of course, would be a constitutional, said the investigation should be local, not even national. But somebody that very week turned it over and it was reviewed in Geneva. And this commission, for all we know, may be investigating that as well. But this whole idea of a trend toward internationalism is something that almost is sneaking in as we do what the conservatives are wanting to do, and that is to move back to the states the control of federal spending. That is, we do block grants, think that we're doing something, at the same time we're expanding the role of these international bodies. And there are plenty of those. There are plenty of organizations that are working around the world that are international. Matter of fact, we're getting ready to do it again. I believe in free trade. I believe in it in a serious manner. I believe that trade should have as low as tariffs as possible. I believe it's a liberty issue that you have the right to spend your money where you want, unless, you know, we're at a time of war or something. But if our car companies are having trouble and you want to buy a Japanese car, I look at it as your personal right to buy a car where you want. Besides, economically, we put pressure on our car companies to do better. So I argue for low tariffs. For that reason, I took a controversial stand and I voted for low tariffs with China. I voted against because I introduced an amendment to stop all the export-import bank subsidies to Red China because they got $4.3 billion of subsidies last year. But I separate those two issues. I would even consider and think that we should trade with Cuba. Quite frankly, the sanctions against Cuba for 40 years have done nothing to get rid of Castro. Castro for 40 years has used United States as a whipping dog for everything that ever failed in Cuba. He says, see, it's those Americans' fault. So I'm for free trade. But I'll tell you what I'm not for. I'm not for international organizations that manage trade for the benefit of special interests, like NAFTA and the World Trade Organization. This is internationalism at the worst, and they're getting ready to do it again. Fast-track legislation is coming up. And if you separate even the principle of fast track from free trade, we shouldn't even accept the principle of fast track. Fast track means that we concede in advance as a Congress powers to the President to negotiate a treaty by majority vote, and we have nothing to say once it comes in. It does not have to be ratified by the Senate by 2/3. And he can go in, and then we have had a careless approach to accepting treaties as overriding our Constitution. And you know, just the whole idea that the United Nations can come in here and look at our laws and our environment and our labor laws, I think is a very, very serious trend. So that's one issue. So I am very vehemently opposed to the principle of fast track, and will be voting against that, even though some will say, oh, he's not voting for free trade. He claims he's for free trade, but he's not for free trade. Well, the other thing is if it takes, I think GATT treaty was 22,000 pages of management on how to do free trade. You know, when the colonies got together and decided they wanted free trade among the colonies, they did it in 3 lines. You know, that's the way the founders thought. They thought very clearly and said there should be no barriers, and the government's responsibility was to break down the barriers, and that was it. But when you have these agreements and you have a World Trade Organization, when that came out, I can remember an ad in the New York Times came out and say, this is wonderful. We finally got the 3rd leg of the New World Order. And they used these terms. You know, it used to be only a few of us would use these terms, and we were considered quite kooky. But our last Republican president made it very conventional to talk about the New World Order. And he says, now we have 3 legs. We have the World Bank, and we have the IMF, and now we have the World Trade Organization. In this fast track, they're talking about, and yet there's been very little publicity about it, they want to tack on, and we can't get a copy of the precise language of the bill. We still have not seen that. But there's a treaty called Multilateral Agreement on Investments, MAI. And if this is passed, this means that any individual, any corporation can appeal any problem with any country involved through this organization rather than going to the state or the government that's involved. In other words, you throw all state law and all federal government law out, and we will make the agreement that any of these concerns will go directly as an individual, further undermining, our sovereignty. This is the trend that we're going in, and I consider it a very serious mistake on our part. I mentioned earlier that I do get a little concerned about some of the rhetoric from our side, and yet we don't do what we should do. The sophomore class is much more aggressive than the freshman class. It was much bigger, and they came demanding reforms. And they're a very good group of people, and they're well motivated. And yet I think they picked the wrong battles. That is the problem. This week, it's interesting. I guess you heard that we all voted for ourselves a pay raise. Well, I didn't vote for that bill, but the way that happened was on the Treasury bill, they deleted the phrase. They deleted the phrase that would have prevented the automatic increase for cost of living. So it has said nothing about pay raising, but it deleted the prevention, because the law says that all federal employees get a cost of living increase. So it was the deletion. It wasn't in a positive sense. It was just in a negative sense. And the pay raise comes out after taxes be about $40 a week. And I think it's an important issue, and I'm opposed to raising the pay of all congressmen. I don't take my retirement benefits because I think they're immoral and atrociously beneficial to the members of Congress. Often said if you got rid of that retirement system, maybe you wouldn't have to pass anything to limit terms. They just wouldn't stay so long. But I don't feel quite so strongly about the $40 a week pay raise, although my position is clear. But the sophomore class, believe this is the most important issue ever, almost. And they're, advocating the repeal, which is okay. But at the same time, they have joined hands in pushing the Schuster bill on transportation, which increases the spending on the highways by $38 billion, claiming that we have our budget under control and that we're just getting some of our money back. That old argument again. That's sort of like arguing for increased Medicare benefits because we have to send so much taxes up there, so let's raise Medicare benefits, something like that. But in spite of that, it's the best part of the Republican caucus is probably the sophomore class. It's just that hopefully if you have the chance to talk to them, guide them in some of the more sound issue, which is really the level of government expenditure. If we're spending at 1.7, the level of government expenditure really is the key. There is a reassessment of what was said when the Republicans took control, and they had listed over 300 programs that were going to be eliminated, and 3 departments. None of that has happened. For instance, the AmeriCorps, which is something that I despise, although it's not gigantic. It's one of those little ones, $426 million last year. I mean, that's piddling. It's been increased to 504 this year. And AmeriCorps is a real darling of the Clintons. And what they have done, they want that to be the basis of national youth service. A real constitutional free market program. But they want the AmeriCorps to expand. So what they have done is they ordered an executive order to use the selective service, the draft registration, in order to take these names, since we don't have a draft, but selective service is still in existence now for 25 years, spending millions of dollars registering kids, which they already have their names, but systematically they make everybody go through this. They use this to supply names and addresses and get leads on getting people into AmeriCorps. And I have a bill that would prevent doing that. I would like to get rid of selective service, and I would like to get rid of AmeriCorps. But we're not very good at this, the Republican leadership in the House, because AmeriCorps actually expanded. under Goals 2000 since the Republicans have taken over. Now you would think Goals 2000, which they wanted to abolish, unfortunately it came in, it was initiated by Bush. And now it's in, and you know what's happened? It's nearly tripled. It went from $231 to $688 million. So big government is alive and well, unfortunately, and the budget is still growing very much. There's a lot of talk about tax reform, and my basic position on tax reform is that taxes ought to be lower, and we ought to get rid of the income tax. But there's a lot of argument up there on what to do right now. Dick Armey wants a flat tax. Bill Archer wants a sales tax. But again, if you're still back to collecting more than 50% of our revenues to finance big government, it's going to be a problem. But I would vote for anything that would reduce the power and control of the IRS. But ultimately, the only thing that will allow our freedoms to expand and our taxes to go down would be a changed attitude about the role of government. As long as the majority of the people in this country still endorse the welfare state, we are going to have a need for taxes, and we are going to have governments pestering us. Even with all these reforms, they never talk about the income tax that we pay, which is called Social Security and Medicare taxes. I did a proposal, and it will appear in my Freedom Report, of assuming that the budget is more honestly dealt with. And there's a couple of things that you can do. One is the interest on the national debt. You could reduce it drastically just like that. Because $1.9 trillion goes to our $1.9 trillion of our debt goes to our agencies like Social Security and other trust funds. So in that sense, we owe it to ourselves. But that is not a trust fund because that money's already been spent, and it all depends on future taxation. So if you take the interest on that, plus the interest we pay the Federal Reserve, and they hold almost $500 billion, you're talking about $2.4 trillion of debt, which is not real debt owned to private owners. So in theory, you could eliminate all that. But it finally dawned on me just recently why that exists. When I was studying OPIC, that's the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is nothing more than a boondoggle for big business, they came and asked for $32 million for operating funds. And they say they are self-sufficient and they pay all their bills and everything is good, but we just need these couple dollars to operate. But then when you look at it, what have they done over all these years? With taxpayers' money, with the money they've earned, they buy treasury bills, which is not negotiable. Treasury bills, the non-negotiable. It's the debt that they just pass on like in a trust fund. And they collect from the Treasury $166 million in interest. So in reality, the appropriation should be 166 plus 32. But nobody thinks about that in those terms. They only think about the 32, which is bad. But you have to think about the entire amount because that is not a true debt. So if you eliminate that $2 trillion, you're going to have interest rates go way down, and then we would be forced to talk about all this on appropriation. OPIC would have a hard time getting $200 million to run its operation, but that's what they're getting. So I would like someday to see people think more in this terms. And then obviously with the Federal Reserve, I mean the Federal Reserve is probably more secretive than the CIA. And I as a member of the Banking Committee can't attend any of the meetings, and I can't audit it. They don't receive an appropriation. They receive all this huge interest payment, then they spend it the way they want, and we can't audit them. So I don't think it should be done. They should be, if we don't, up until we get rid of the Federal Reserve, they should at least be on budget and the amount of money they spend appropriated and treated like another agency of government. But that is not likely to happen. They happen to have some very powerful forces behind them. But the income tax, to me, is the most atrocious tax. Frank Chodoroff, a libertarian of a few years back, said income taxation is in principle the worst of all forms of taxation because it begins by asserting the prior right of the state to all our wealth. So they began with 1% or so on a few people, but they made the principle stick that they had a prior right to all our wealth. This is why the liberal argues when we propose that we cut taxes, they say, you can't do that. That's going to cost the government so much money. If I give you back 10% of your taxes, if your tax rate goes from 30 to 20, they say they can't afford it. It costs the government too much money. You're making the assumption that our wealth and our lives and our property belongs to the state. And that's the assumption. That is why medicine is in such shambles, is because of that same assumption, that they have this obligation and this moral authority to claim that they have control over our lives and services. And as long as that principle stands, we'll have a very, very tough time. Now, I do want to leave some time for questions, but I want to try to wind this up and talk a little bit more about those principles in medicine. I imagine most everybody in this room have heard of or read the book Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged was a very important book. It still is one of the most sold books in the country, written by Ayn Rand. Of course, Rand is an objectivist and an atheist and has an approach to philosophy which I don't agree with in many ways. But she still was a great novelist, and she still emphasized the importance of standing on principle. And I think that's why I enjoy this organization so well, because we have been known to stand on principle and send the right messages out, even though at times there were only a few sending that message out and more now. So that, to me, pleases me. But there was a physician there that, you know, the theme of Atlas Shrugged is that if they are going to do that to us, we're going on strike and we'll deny them our services. That I don't quite agree with. There's an alternative to it, but it makes an important point. And the doctor that was in Atlas Shrugged was a Dr. Hendricks, and he was talking about this ability to provide service. He said, that was what I would not place at the disposal of men whose sole qualification to rule me was their capacity to spout the fraudulent generalities that got them elected to the privilege of enforcing their wishes at the point of a gun. I would not let them dictate the purpose for which my years of study had been spent, or the condition of my work, or my choice of patients, or the amount of my reward. I have often wondered at the smugness with which people assert their right to enslave me, to control my work, to enforce my will, to violate my conscience, to stifle my mind. Yet what is it that they expect to depend on when they lie on an operating table under my hands? Their moral code has taught them to believe it is safe to rely on the virtue of their victims. Well, that is the virtue I have withdrawn. Let them discover the kind of doctors that their system will now produce. You know, she wrote that in 1957, 40 years ago, and we're approaching that point where we are seeing the production of doctors in a much different manner. I have no personal resentment from foreign doctors coming in here. Matter of fact, in many ways I have had close contact with foreign doctors who've come to this country, and I claim they're more American than some of our doctors. They're good physicians, and they come in and they practice well, and they love the freedom, and they support me wholeheartedly. I have a few doctors that have come from Cuba, and I can hardly say that about them. But then again, I see our many hospitals so often filled by foreign doctors that can barely speak the language, and you wonder, where are the American doctors? Where are they being trained? And here we hear our U.S. Congress is willing and anxious now to pay our medical schools not to train American doctors. There's something gone screwy with our system. And yet we are continually coming under the gun of physicians controlled by the government. The choice we're going to have to make is whether or not we want to live under this system of or not. I don't believe we should go on strike. I guess in a way I go on strike when I leave my practice. I go to Washington, and I've done that a couple times. But just think of the worst conditions that existed in the Soviet Union, which we all pray, and I don't believe we'll ever get that bad. I don't think we're moving toward communism or socialism. I fear much more fascism. But think of the very worst days in the Soviet Union. There were still private physicians. There were still those who would not participate, that worked in the underground economy, that worked with a blink and a wink from the government, and who came and patronized them? The government officials, because they were men of integrity. I mean, we are a remnant. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know whether kiddie care is going to lead to worse conditions or whether a medical savings account will lead to better conditions. I happen to think both. They'll get worse before they get better, but then they're going to get better. But hopefully not too bad. But there's something wrong with a system that has permitted the interjection of a corporate welfare state between us and our patients, where they're raking off a huge sum of money to manage the care, where so many physicians have succumbed to the notion that and be willing to call some bureaucrat, some insurance bureaucrat across the country and ask him if it's permission to admit a patient and what day we can discharge them. We've gotten to a point now where, yes, it's out of control. The management companies tell us we have to discharge patient after 24 or 48 hours. And what seems to be happening by so many who have an influence in Washington, they go to Washington and ask Congress to vote on a bill that tells us how long the patient should be in. Both answers are wrong, obviously. The only answer is the private practice of medicine. The private practice of medicine has to be kept alive, and that's what our job is. And that's why this organization, there's no other medical organization like this that is willing to fight on principle to keep this alive. So it is up to us to do this. It is crucial. How it will come out, I do not know. But I do know that it is very, very important that we do what we are doing and fighting for this, and not to compromise. And I know there are options. I know it is very difficult. And this whole idea right now that there is legislation or the law that was just recently passed said that if somebody practices medicine and has a private contract, it will cancel him out from participating in any other government-type program. Well, that's a mixed bag in many ways, but the whole idea that they will attack the notion that somebody wants to move over and have a private contract and make it illegal, I think is a very, very dangerous idea. I've been involved in politics a long time. I am very much interested in maintaining my skills in medicine, which is getting more difficult all the time. More difficult now than when I was in the Congress before. But it's something that I want to do because I still think as a physician, my goal in life was wanting to be a good physician. I cannot remember a more exciting day, short of many family events, but the excitement of leaving my residency and going into a small town and opening up a practice all by myself and having my patients. That to me was very exciting, and the responsibility, which was very great in the town that I went in. I did not have a general surgeon, I did not have an anesthesiologist, yet I was doing surgeries that required a lot more responsibility than the average hospital would put on a doctor today. But that is something that I love and I want to hang on to. But political action is so important for all of us, no matter at what level that we are, because it is in politics, the main purpose of politics is to seek liberty. I see no other purpose. If we see politics as to seek a special benefit, then we're off on the wrong track. This is why the lobbyists for the AMA are off track. They do not come and ask me for more liberty. They come for other reasons, as do 95% of all the other lobbyists. They have a right to lobby, but they don't have a moral right to steal. And there's a big difference, and that's what most of them are doing. They come to steal. Our goal in political action should be to strive for liberty. When we have liberty and we have freedom of choice and freedom of association and freedom to practice, then we can strive under those conditions for excellence and virtue, strive for economic and spiritual well-being. And it's only under a free society that this can be achieved. But once we get the government involved in those goals, trying to make us better people, telling us how to live and telling us what to smoke and drink and how to live. And once we have the government telling us how to improve the economic conditions of everyone, then we destroy the number one issue, and that is liberty. You cannot have both if you allow the government this role. So my purpose in being politically active is to strive for liberty, to allow us in a free society to strive for excellence. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If it's time, I'll take questions. Thank you. Thank you.
When do you have to leave? 11:30, I understand?
Yeah,
You have to
but
leave here.
you just tell me when you're tired of me.
That is informative. It alerts us. It energizes us. Ron Paul is on a, I won't say a short leash, that's pejorative, but his turnaround time is short. He's going to accept questions, and I want to mention that. And also, something I alluded to earlier, the lead article in the Tribune, 3 AMA executives depart after Sunbeam fiasco, continued on page 12. Jane Orient is quoted on page 12. Susan DeMars is affecting and probably actually doing most of the work herself. We're going to have printed copies of that for you who didn't. You got to put your tag outside the door and you get the complimentary paper. Anyway, but Ron will accept questions now.
Congratulations, Dr. Paul.
Thank you.
Being the lead United States representative in the Conservative Index. What happened to your television program At Issue?
The At Issue programs were put on by the foundation. We did 13 programs, and that was the initial plan. They were sort of set aside. They're sort of available, but no new programs were planned, mainly because that was about the time we moved into the campaign and there was too much activity. But it's something that I haven't forgotten about, and because I think ultimately the television is still a strong, powerful political vehicle and an educational vehicle. Someday I hope to be able to start those up again. Thank you.
Congressman, can you yet propose elements of a new contract with America?
What elements would be there? My choice or Gingrich's choice? Mine. Well, I think my contract would be to probably do it in one line. Let's all obey the Constitution. That's a pretty good contract. We could deal with, the privacy issue, property rights issue, the money issue, the foreign policy issue. All those issues could be handled without a distraction from a contract, a different type of contract. That's sort of disappointing when we have to have a taxpayer's Bill of Rights, which I have, I guess, in the past voted for that, which is okay. But why don't we use the old Bill of Rights to protect individual liberty rather than the taxpayer's Bill of Rights? Yes, sir.
Yes, this is slightly off the topic of medicine, but I think it's very important. I have heard, and I do not have verifications, but about a year and a half ago, somebody gave me a little article talking about a privacy issue that was supported by Louis Freeh and Clinton, as far as getting a bill passed trying to pre-wire all new phones for taps, relaxing search and seizure laws, monitoring email, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any truth to that? Is there such a bill, and if so, is it just a table, or is it?
Yes, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to give you as precise an answer as I should, but when there was the breakup of the communications industry, they were trying to require that all telephone companies make it available so that the government could, if there was any encryption on our computers, our telephones, that they would always be able to tap our phones. There is a piece of legislation, and I think really where it stands is in limbo. They neither have the right nor has moved, but there is a desire for that, because I know I'm on a piece of legislation that says that the encryption should be permitted. You know, you might say bad things on there, but you might even bring up ideas of freedom and free markets on the computers. But the encryption and keeping it private, I think, is very crucial. But I think that is a very important concern, because I know the government is always interested in destroying our privacy. They claim it's always for the war on drugs, but it's usually just trying to find out where the money is so they can wring out a few more dollars in taxes from us. That's probably the strongest motivation.
John Shattuck of Arizona has been one of the leaders in Congress trying to provide constitutional justification for any new law enacted by Congress. Can you tell us where this stands? Is there a bill? Are there sponsors? Where's that going?
The one that would require that the Constitution be followed. He probably has 15 or 20 co-sponsors. I haven't looked at it recently. I'm a co-sponsor, and hopefully someday there will be a lot more. But again, you know, if everybody took their oath of office seriously, we probably wouldn't have to have another piece of legislation. But I think it's a very good piece of legislation to bring to attention this very important issue of rule of law. You know, whether or not we're going to follow the laws or not, or whether we're just going to be people who follow the power and the influence of special interest.
Thank God for the life of Congress Ron Paul.
Thank you.
Bring in little rays of sunlight in a smoggy, foggy, or condescending, bureaucratic, regulatory, suffocating environment. And we're all drowning in that. My reference, Your Honor, is to medical savings accounts and questioning the authority of Congress. Medical savings accounts, in my perception, no less than the embodiment of the Declaration of Independence, i.e., if you empower the individual, you empower life. If you defend freedom of choice, you defend liberty. If you defend the pursuit of happiness, you defend basically the MSAs, which is my investment in my pursuit of my happiness for my family, etc., etc. Now, how does Congress get the authority to limit that natural right by birth and being an American citizen to 750,000 units? Number one. Number two, is there a lawful recourse? Two references. Number one also is the base that Congress is not authorized, I should say, Congress itself is not authorized by the Constitution to practice medicine, number one. Number two, Section 1801, 2, and 3 of Medicare law prohibit that. Where do they get the authority? What is a lawful recourse to get them off the bat?
Well, I think they get their authority by just taking it, unfortunately. And you know, in a way that is true. You sort of concede a little bit of what Shadowroff was saying about the income tax. Once you allow them to hand us back some of these special things under certain conditions, the danger is that you concede to them that they have the authority to tell us what we can do. But they just take the authority. They're supported by the courts. A lot of our liberties were taken away from the courts as well. They do it, and they do it because I guess we're complacent. The American people are complacent because they are doing well, and they think they're going to get some benefits. And as long as the country is fairly wealthy, it looks like we will be, the majority of the people will still be tolerant enough to let this government continue as it is.
Two questions. Considering that you were in Washington 15 years ago, how do you view the atmosphere within the conservative spectrum in Washington now and 15 years ago? How many colleagues do you have? What's the general atmosphere from that perspective?
I think the atmosphere is better, but the country's better. You know, I think I see more people outside of Washington who are very leery of what the Congress is doing, which I think is where I find my biggest amount of optimism, is the fact that people are waking up. But the Congress is somewhat better, but unfortunately not enough. And I think they still lack deep understanding. Like I was mentioning, a sophomore class is probably the strongest class, and are motivated, but I don't think they see the big picture as much as they see a smaller picture. I mean, they might be willing to go along with some of these appropriation bills, which I think most of us in this room would consider atrocious, and yet maybe fight a big battle over you know, the funding for some committee, which might not be very much. So the rhetoric is better. The organizations in Washington, like Cato and others, they're better. And I think my reception is different. I think there's always been some respect, even though some would think it was a little weird, but generally respect. But more so now. I have more younger members coming up asking me in a very serious manner to explain to them, you know, certain ways. So I think it's there, but we still need a lot of basic education of the Constitution and the principles of liberty.
In discussing the movement over the past 30 years toward the left, we've often talked about the so-called salami technique.
Of the what?
Salami technique, the one slice at a time, small increments and so on. In your opinion, should we reverse this by the same type of technique, or do you think that there is going to need to be a greater incremental type of jump, not necessarily a revolution?
I work on the assumption that if you can do it incrementally, you should try, and I do by running for office and voting on a day-to-day basis. I do not work on the assumption that within a year or two it's going to be real successful, and if it isn't successful, then I'm going to be very disappointed. I don't work on that assumption. I work on the assumption that we're going to have a major crisis. I think our problems in medicine are going to get a lot worse before they get better. I think they're going to get a lot worse in the budget and all these problems. And it might be at the end of the decade, you know, when the computers quit working. Wouldn't it be great if the IRS computer quits working at the end of the decade? I mean, then it's not going to be incrementalism. It's going to have to be a major thing. That's why, as I said, I don't introduce amendments that nibble away. I want to deal entirely on the principle of the issue so that when the time comes, we can make our case. And I think it's okay for others to do it other ways. I don't think everybody has to do exactly as I do it, but I think organizations like this ought to, you know, and we do, and that's important. But I don't think the solution would be sort of like saying, should we all just sort of disband and infiltrate the AMA because we know that we can influence AMA policy all of a sudden in Washington. You know what kind of frustration you'd meet there. So I think it's better to have another organization and be quoted more often in the newspapers and be seen more often in Washington.
I don't know if Dr. Danaher is still here, but I did want to make a comment that the feds tried to change the definition in a selective way of complex closure, which is a term for closure of a wound and taking care of it in a certain way. And it was the dermatologist who helped us along to go up there and use the word fraud on the part of the federals. If they were going to change one selective definition in the CPT codes and say they were using it, and just say thanks a lot for that. I also, and we did it, and we got them to back down on that, and that means they're going to have to spend a little bit more money than they would have, and I think that that's a good thing. We need to hold their feet to the fire. Thank you for coming. Although I'm from Florida, I did contribute to your campaign. I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions. Do you think that it would be fair to compare AmeriCorps with the Red Guard?
Not yet, but maybe later. I think the basic principle, excuse me, is very similar, but not quite that bad yet.
The other thing is Roth IRA, where you pay the taxes now and you pull it out later tax-free. If I'm doing that for the next 5 years and then start pulling it out 5 years from now tax-free, and then they find what that has done is allowed us to spend more now and still call it a balanced budget. What happens over the next 30 years while I'm pulling that out? If I've got any income from any other sources and they find that they have a shortfall, then they're going to have to tax what I don't pull out of my IRA. There's an Italian word, Hanzi, I think.
You know, what you're saying is you can't trust the government to live up to their contracts, and you're right. They might do all kinds of things to our pension funds or IRA funds. Okay.
It seems outrageous that we should have to have an act of Congress to say that Medicare beneficiaries should not be deprived of the right to spend their own money. And,
That's a shame.
yes. But the worst feature of the bill that purportedly is supposed to help that is that you should have to report to Congress on any Medicare beneficiary who tries to do that. So I hope you'll consider offering an amendment to the bill to assure that seniors are allowed to retain their privacy. It's not violated just because they see a private doctor. Do you understand what I mean in the bill that was proposed to affect this change?
Are you asking me the bill?
Yeah, the budget reconciliation bill that was a perverted version of the Kyle Amendment to assure the right to private contracting gives the Secretary the right to demand reporting to assure that care provided under private contracts is of high quality and to see the effect on the budget and so on. So if there is a bill introduced to get rid of the most onerous portions of this Budget Reconciliation Act, I hope you'll pay careful attention to any potential reporting requirements.
Okay, yes, that's for sure. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you once again, Ron. And we're going to go on a break. We're going to go on a break, but I will make an announcement before that. Email. Ron Paul is on email.
Thank you very much.
His email address is www.house.government/Paul. And Paul is like it sounds. You can also sign up for his Freedom Watch email service. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll resume with report from the front lines. Thank you.